Hello all and welcome, and I am the Mgtow Philosopher. And in this video I would like to give you a brief history of the first, second, and third waves of feminism. Brief because an in-depth history would take hours. I want to do this because some of you out there might not be very familiar with the feminist movement, and this way you'll have a better idea of some of the things I'm talking about in my other videos. Now in this video I'm going to be reading some simple historical overviews that cover the basics, and then I'm going to be giving you my commentary on what I'm reading as I go. Now when my tone of voice changes, you'll know I'm giving commentary. Now, that and the wording, of course. And when my tone of voice changes back, you'll know I'm again citing the material. So let's start with the first wave of feminism, shall we? First wave feminism was a period of feminist activity and thought that occurred within the time period of the 19th and early 20th century throughout the world. Right. Various forces of socialism wanted to change the face of the Western world, and how best to do that than to get irrational people, meaning women, into the voting booths. It focused on legal issues, primarily on gaining women's suffrage, the right to vote. Right, that's what I just said. Of course, that was its main focus, so that once they got the vote, they could then be used as the useful idiots that they were to achieve the goals of the global elites. Feminism has its source in the 18th century, specifically in the Enlightenment. In this cultural and philosophical movement, there was a controversy over equality and gender differences. Right. This crap was coming up even back then in the 18th century, especially in France around the time of the French Revolution, as women saw this upheaval as a chance to gain more privileges in society. Thankfully, they failed at that time. Now, at that time appeared a new critical discourse that used the universal categories of this political philosophy. Enlightenment movement, therefore, was not about feminism at its roots. The political origins of feminism came from the French Revolution, not the Enlightenment. Thank God. This event raised legal equality, freedoms, and political rights as its central objectives, but soon came the great contradiction that marked the struggle of early feminism, such as freedoms, rights, and legal equality that had been the great conquest of the liberal revolutions that didn't affect women. Of course not. Women are not men. The men are the ones doing all the work, doing all the fighting, essentially earning all the money, and taking all the risks in life. The women lived longer, and the men worked themselves to death. So, of course, there would be no major changes for women. And by the way, if you think man is somehow privileged because he gets to die sooner via working himself to death while she sits at home, then you're an idiot. Rousseau's political theory designed the exclusion of women from the field of property rights. So in the French Revolution, the voice of women began to express themselves collectively. Good. As far as denying women property rights, women shouldn't be allowed to own property, because then they can argue that it gives them the right to vote. Bravo for Rousseau. Of course, nowadays, I don't see that as a way to exclude women from voting. Other mechanisms would be needed, because you can't just go and steal people's shit now that they own it. And unless there's some major upheaval and we have the overthrow of the government and a new system is initiated, you're not going to see women losing property or losing their right to vote. Of course, if this happens and there's some major upheaval and the system is overthrown, we can only hope that the pussies out there who push egalitarianism are not the ones designing that new system. Now, the term first wave was coined in March 1968 by Martha Lear, writing in the New York Times Magazine, who at the same time also used the term second wave feminism. At that time, the women's movement was focused on de facto unofficial inequalities, which it wished to distinguish from the objectives of the earlier feminists. De facto inequalities, essentially fancy weasel speech for the things that exist between men and women that are naturally unequal and demonstrate themselves in real life via how we act and perform real-life tasks. Women up to that point in time had demonstrated very well that they lacked the faculties required to do certain things as well as men. So they were, of course, unequal. You should watch my video entitled Equality is Bullshit to understand more. Equal just means two things are the same, and unequal means not the same. It has nothing to do with legal equality. People too often get these two things confused and conflate them. So That is a very quick overview of the first wave of feminism. It worked very hard to get the vote up until 1920, and then by restructuring, changing, and destroying America over time with stupid socialist ideas like the welfare state so as to grow the government, make it more socialist, aka central planning, and to eventually bankrupt it. The left continued to transform the country from 1920 to 1965 when they had finally corrupted it enough to be able to get the 1965 immigration bill passed, something that deserves its own video. Anyhow, that was one of their bigger attacks on America, meant to destroy it by displacing whites, since America was 90% white at that time. Their goal was to turn the country into a third world hellhole where everyone was equal, equally miserable, that is. Next, let us discuss second wave feminism, shall we? Second wave feminism is a period of feminist activity and thought that first began in the early 1960s in the United States and eventually spread throughout the world and beyond. Throughout the Western world and beyond. Yes, it spread all right and took root and flourished in other Western countries that did not have the kind of protections we do in regards to freedom of speech. Hence why some Western countries like Sweden are actually way worse off in many respects than America is. In the United States, the movement lasted through the early 1980s. It later became a worldwide movement that was strong in Europe and parts of Asia, such as Turkey and Israel, where it began in the 1980s, and it began at other times in other countries. Yes, feminism is like cancer, and it spreads very easily. It offers easy answers and easy solutions. It sounds good and requires little thought, just like religion. You can base your whole life around this shit and never have to think for yourself. How wonderful. Whereas first-wave feminism focused mainly on suffrage and overturning legal obstacles to gender equality, right, they really mean artificial gender equality because men and women are not equal to begin with. Voting rights and property rights, yes, so that it would be more difficult to take the vote away if anyone ever tried to do so in the future. Second-wave feminism broadened the debate to a wide range of issues: sexuality, family, the workplace, reproductive rights, de facto inequalities, and official legal inequalities. Wait, I thought that wave one was focused on so-called de facto inequalities. By the way, I think men and women have plenty of de facto inequalities. From a natural point of view, we are in no way equal. You can't get more de facto than that. As for reproductive rights, what they really mean is that a man should have zero say in the matter, which is now the case. As for the workplace, this was not a problem before, as women generally didn't work in the past. As for sexuality, that was reserved for marriage. But marriage is the enemy, so we, meaning the leftist globalist elites, must free women to explore their capricious and irresponsible natures. Of course! Second-wave feminism also drew attention to domestic violence and marital rape issues, establishment of rape crisis and battered women's shelters, and changes in custody and divorce law. Of course, nowhere will you find battered men's shelters, even though women are as violent as men. Yes, domestic violence, meaning that if he gets hit by her, he goes to jail. But when, right. I mean, this domestic violence stuff is bullshit. Basically, the way this works is, if she hits him, if he hits her, right, he goes to jail. But when she bashes him over the head with a frying pan, no consequences. And if he defends himself, he goes to jail also. Seems like a very good way to make women never responsible while making men always guilty. You should check out my video entitled "Women Are More Violent Than Men." Any number of studies, both historical and group studies, are cited. They simply lack the girth and physical strength to do as much damage as a man, but they are more violent, and they tend to use weapons more as well. As for rape crisis and rape within a marriage, please, what do you think men back then got married for? To have someone to talk to? No, to have a ready piece of ass waiting for them when he was ready, and to take care of the resulting kids. It's only of late that you have this cuck boy, wussy boy, romantic love incentive to get married for men, where she says no to sex 90% of the time, and that's considered perfectly reasonable and normal and okay. And when the second wavers spoke of custody and divorce law, they were speaking of making it easier for women to divorce men, and they also wanted to always get the kids and alimony, which they did. Of course they did. This lasted until the late 80s, mind you, this second wave of feminism, and it is responsible for many of the core problems that men face, from no-fault divorce to unfair alimony laws to courts being almost completely one-sided when it comes to giving women custody of kids. And for those of you who think that the big problem is just the most recent incarnation of feminism, i.e. the third wave, think again. Both first and second wave feminism were all about enfranchising women so that they could de-enfranchise men and become the superior group running things. The oppressed become the oppressors. It is the dominant narrative and paradigm shift of socialism. Of course, the useful idiots don't understand that they are nothing more than dupes and will never hold any real power. But during the time that they are being useful idiots and shifting power away from the so-called oppressors, they get to enjoy a nice long period of superiority and in turn a relatively easy life. It won't last, but they don't look ahead very much anyway. They lack the critical thinking skills to foresee the eventual outcome, which will be them dead in a ditch, as their usefulness will eventually have run out. Many historians view the second wave feminism era in America as ending in the early 1980s with the intra-feminism disputes of the feminist sex wars over issues such as sexuality and pornography, which ushered in the era of third wave feminism in the early 1990s, essentially 1990. So essentially the movement became more radical, as it had to if it was going to transform the country beyond the bedlam that had already taken place up to that point. As some of the older feminists from the second wave were not so radical, so feminism began to split. As girls, who were now women coming of age, and who were the most entitled and brainwashed youth to ever grace American streets with their presence, came of age, it wasn't so hard to infuse them with this more radical ideology. They'd already grown up with second-wave feminism after all, and leftist ideology, so not so hard to infuse them with this crap. Hence, the move toward the third wave of feminism, which is supposedly the worst of them all, and the only really bad one, right? The other two are just fine. It's just third-wave feminism that gives feminism a bad name. The prior two waves were perfectly fine, no problem with them. Third-wave feminism encompasses several diverse strains of feminist activity and study. Though exact boundaries are a subject of debate, it is generally marked as beginning in the early 1990s, essentially in 1990. And yes, as we all know, that is when things went from very bad to much, much worse. And we have third-wave feminism to thank for it. And this also explains all of these college retards we now have, these social justice warriors who were born at the start of third-wave feminism. And continuing to the present, it is an individual movement in the sense that its purpose includes redefining what it is to be a feminist. Of course, the leftists, the global elites, they didn't want any controls. You should be free to define what feminism means to you. Hence, if you are an uber radical and you believe sexism is everywhere and racism is everywhere, then you're going to see it in everything that happens around you. And because feminism is now an individual movement where there are no guidelines for what it is, it's just your interpretation of reality, then you can now feel free to label any and everything as sexist and racist, thereby scaring the shit out of everyone who doesn't want to be called sexist and racist and making them all shut up. It's so brilliant of the left, this decentralization of power and removal of definitions for what constitutes sexism or any kind of ism. It's all open to interpretation after all, isn't it? Which means you'll just project your own biases onto reality and see sexism and racism in every action that happens around you. And this shit is straight out of the Frankfurt School. It's negative philosophy at its best. The third wave arose partially as a response to the perceived failures of second-wave feminism. Yeah, meaning that women had yet to gain enough control of the country and white people in general had not been disenfranchised and displaced enough by flooding the workplace with women, destabilizing the family, and flooding the country with illegal wetbacks who'll work for a nickel an hour. Hence the need to double down and become more militant, more radical. And the backlash against initiatives and movements created during the 60s, 70s, and 80s. When they say backlash, what they mean is people who opposed some aspects of the feminist movement. Hence, they had to become more militant, more violent, and more radical to fight against these things, which is why we have some old hag feminists running around now decrying third wave feminism, but not decrying the first and second waves. They love all the so-called progress women have made, so they just see the third wave of feminism as poisonous, and that in pushing and pushing and pushing to see what boundaries they could push out to, that some women had pushed too far. Sadly, it's kind of hard to control members of a movement that has no centralized power structure, that has such ill-defined, vague definitions for things, meaning that you should define what it is and isn't to be sexist, that even the definition of what is feminist is completely arbitrary and lies solely within the person you are asking. It's pretty hard to control a movement like that. It's so vague and ambiguous and arbitrary in how it defines and labels things, even itself. So now you have these old hag bitches running around like chickens with their heads cut off, lecturing people and selling lots of books to people about how evil third wave feminism is and how men and women are actually different and that men should get more credit. All the while, they firmly believe first and second wave feminism were just fine and that men and women are totally equal. Wait a second, what? Well, that's a totally contradictory position to hold. But okay. It attempts to expand feminism to include women with a diverse set of identities, meaning they needed to get more soldiers, and privileged white girls from well-to-do families just weren't cutting it. Recognizing that women are of many colors, ethnicities, nationalities, religions, and cultural backgrounds. No. Feminists just needed more boots on the ground for protests and to bully people so that they could gain superiority. Their job was already done by the early 1980s. They already had the parity in society that they wanted. But they didn't want parity. They didn't want equality. They wanted superiority. Or better to say the billionaire globalists and their trillionaire Uber puppet masters, they needed more change. Hence, women and minorities needed to become more prominent, more powerful, and more enfranchised than simply being equal. You see, for the goals of the globalists, they want more. They need more change. Equality is not enough. They need more than just being equal. Equality is not enough. So they need superiority for the goals of the globalists to ever come to fruition. So, yeah, let's convert everyone to communism. Oh, I mean feminism. Sorry, Freudian slip by me. Thus, it can be seen as a reaction to or continuation of second-wave feminism and constitutes a partial destabilization of constructs from the second wave. Okay, this is doublespeak for the fact that many of the older feminists had different ideas and were not as radical as many of the younger feminists, and didn't agree with many of the extreme views being pushed by many of the younger and even some of the older feminists. I guess some of them knew that such radical actions might turn people against them or feared that such a thing might happen. And this caused a schism, as it was meant to. Radical feminism today could not work if the movement had key leaders who had a great deal of influence within the movement. Then those people could exercise at least some control, which would be bad for the globalists, as they wanted and needed radical demonstrations to happen constantly. Now you have kids taking over colleges and banning white people from campus as they patrol the campus grounds, walking around with baseball bats. Way to go, radical leftists. Destabilization was the goal, so as to create as much chaos, destruction, and damage as possible. And it worked. It worked very well, in fact. The related concept of intersectionality was introduced in 1989, a few years before the third wave began, but it was during this wave that the concept was embraced. Intersectionality. What a bunch of horse shit. And this is what I spoke of. This was a clever little tool of the leftists to convince dummies that all these things such as race, sex, sexual identity, etc., were all somehow connected, and therefore you essentially got to create a giant uber army of leftists who before were just disparate, unaffiliated groups, but now the left has managed to get them to join together by convincing them they all have something in common, being they are oppressed, all of them. Talk about clever. The left found a way to unite feminists with real Nazis and Muslims who actually oppress women, and gays who are men, but it's okay because they're gay, so they're oppressed, so it's okay to work with them. In essence, any and every other vile type of person you could think of can be called oppressed. So you can bring them together just because they all share a common enemy, which is their so-called oppressor, that being white men. You have to admit, it's pretty clever. Now, this intersectionality shit, combined with a further emphasis on relativism and interpretive thinking in regards to objective reality, have helped propel the left's agenda further and faster than even many of the global elites believe possible. And they have learned many valuable lessons from their successes. Now, 27 years later, since all this shit started around 1990, anyone who hadn't been in America since, say, 1985, they wouldn't recognize the place if they returned to it. Yeah, everything's changed for the worse. Rebecca Walker coined the term third wave to highlight the focus on queer and non-white women. Yes, the whole intersectionality thing. Become a champion for people who before hadn't even asked for a champion, pretend to be their friend and ally, then indoctrinate as many non-white people as possible to your leftist viewpoint, and then make them into soldiers in your army. Brilliant! In 1992, she published an article in response to the Anita Hill case in order to express her offense at what she saw as the silencing of women by men who commit acts of sexual harassment and other forms of oppression, and who use their privilege to escape justice for such injustices. You mean like women do? Stating, I am not a post-feminist feminist. I am the third wave. Yes, you have a very high opinion of yourself, don't you? You're probably the third wave because you're so fucking fat. The sexual harassment she's talking about, by the way, are things like catcalling, talking about a woman in an explicit way with either that woman you're talking about or another woman within earshot, you know, because they're so strong that they can't handle talk of that nature in their presence. Oh, and yes, she is the third wave. You know, it sounds kind of like the Third Reich, doesn't it? And indeed, many of their terror tactics remind me of the Third Reich. Intimidations, beatings in the street of those who don't agree with their party line, social justice designed to destroy people's livelihoods because they have the wrong opinion. It sounds very much like the Third Reich to me. Walker sought to establish that third-wave feminism was not just a reaction, but a movement in and of itself because women's issues were far from over. Meaning that if this more radical way of acting did not work out and was somehow considered too radical by the American people, that it would not harm the first and second waves of feminism. You see, branding this as third wave and separate from the first and second wave was a preemptive move to guard the gains that feminists had already made in case third wave feminism backfired and wasn't well received. It's simple tactics, really. Don't put all your eggs in one basket, diversify your forces, and make sure that each group that fights for you is insulated from harm should another group fall. Third-wave feminists have broadened their goals. Yes, they have. Focusing on ideas like queer theory, abolishing gender role expectations, and stereotypes. Yes, if you want to know where this shit comes from, you need to only look into the minds of women. Only women could come up with this nonsense. Genders don't exist. Meanwhile, give me free shit because I'm a woman. Yep, talk about double standards, even within their own movement. Unlike the determined opposition of second-wave feminists to women in pornography, sex work, and prostitution. Okay, let's get one thing straight. First and second-wave feminism are evil. They believe most of what the third-wavers do, they were just hypocrites to boot. They wanted to be sexually liberated, but had a problem with whores selling sex. That's because those women threatened the value of their goods and services that they could offer a man. Same goes for pornography. Women don't hate it because it somehow oppresses women. Please. No, they hate it because it's one more thing that can replace them. Nowadays, they want to be able to corner a man, use sex as a weapon to get him to commit, but at the same time, they don't want any competition that makes sex easier to get, even though they supposedly freed women so that those women could be liberated to pursue whatever avenue they wanted. Yet that creates the very competition they don't want. Talk about not thinking about the possible consequences of your actions. And some of you out there want these creatures to vote and decide policy for your country, since they're the majority of voters. My God, are you kidding me? You folks need to wake up and get a clue. You don't want these people voting. Third wave feminists were rather ambiguous and divided about these themes. The reference feminist sexual wars, while some thought these sexual acts were degrading and oppressing to women. Yeah, that would be the fat, ugly, never will be attractive to man type of feminist who wants all women to suffer because she has suffered and she can't get a man. Others saw it as empowering that women were owning their sexuality. That would be the feminists who could actually get a man and were not angry and bitter about other women being able to do so. There was also a divide in opinion, but third-wave feminism embraced differences, personal narratives, and individualism instead of all having one agenda. Of course, you cannot have a unifying agenda. If you do, then it's very hard to deviate from that and form your own personal idea of what feminism means to you. It's much more difficult to make ideologues, it's much more difficult to make ideologues go wild and crazy on their adversaries if you have well-defined definitions of what constitutes bad behavior on the part of your enemy, as well as what your actual goals are beyond the vague and non-specific goals you hear nowadays. Basically, if you define things well, it's very difficult to, in the moment, subjectively make it okay to terrorize and beat up other people who essentially disagree with you. And as we all know, a zealot will function much better if left to pursue their own idea of what the cause is than if he or she is supposed to pursue someone else's vision. There were exceptions, such as rape culture and equal pay. Now, this is very interesting. Yes, there were exceptions. Everybody should be able to decide what their view of feminism is, but we're going to create some exceptions now. Yeah, of course you're going to create exceptions because these are things that you want to be believed by everybody. You can't have some hierarchy power structure that can control the narrative of things, of course the media and such, but nothing formally. But you've got to have these messages that everybody agrees on. So these are things that they agreed with even from second-wave feminism, such as rape culture and equal pay, both of which are total falsifications, fabrications that are pushed as truth. It's propaganda designed to further the agenda of making it so that women earn more than men. That's it. And so that men will stop sleeping with random women and just get married for fear of rape accusations. I made a video on this called The Always Believe Her Narrative. You should check it out. The focus was less on political changes and more on individualistic identity. Right, because political changes would be bad to focus on. Too specific now that the main political goals have been reached. No, make it about the individual because political winds shift and change, and those changes might be at odds with the goals of the globalist elites, thereby detracting from the overarching goal of destabilizing and destroying utterly that which is Western culture. So instead, make the movement about each individual person's own subjective feelings. All you need is to give them the core teachings of the leftist ideology, and their feelings will do the rest. And boy, oh boy, have they done the rest. And there you go. That's a short history of the first three schools of feminism, right up to the fourth wave, which is trying to get a foothold by calling itself anti-feminism, just as it was predicted that the new fascists would call themselves anti-fascists. This movement, anti-feminism, is mainly older feminists trying to dial back some of the wacky, out-of-control hounds that were let off their leashes 27 years back and return all of us to the wonderful, stable society we had under first and second wave feminism. I also made a video on this titled Anti-Feminism is Just Feminism. So I don't want to speak about that here. You can go check my video out on that. It'll give you much more information on the fourth wave of feminism. And that's it. I hope you enjoyed, and I'm Mgtow Philosopher. I wish you a good day. Take care.